Our gospel reading this morning shouldn't come as a surprise at this point. It's from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, starting with verse 25. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed on by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3 do you suppose was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." The Gospel of our Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. There are probably some among us for whom that's the first time hearing that story, but for others, it's a deeply familiar story, right? I see some nodding heads. We know this story. And I've probably preached on it several times at least, not necessarily in this context. But today, for some reason, I just am approaching it from a slightly different angle. I think we get the core message. Jesus doesn't really mince words about it. There's a good idea about having the law right, understanding the law of love, but there's also something different about doing the law of love, right? So he says, you've understood rightly, now go do it, he says. And then he tells the story to clarify, and then he says, go and do likewise, right? So that's the deep, it's fairly straightforward. But I think there's lots more in here that's worth exploring, and as I thought about our community at Emmanuel, I thought, what could we explore in this story? And what came to my mind was the question of boundaries. I thought, let's explore how boundaries work in a story like this. Now, this may seem strange, because I know we've got a whole bunch of mystics around here, people who like the oneness and the unity, right? And I do promise you, I'm working on a sermon for July 25th on feeling into the oneness. How's that sound, you guys? So I'm not abandoning the oneness. I'm not abandoning the unity. But it's also important to see that in an embodied world, in an incarnate world, in this world that we live in, boundaries do merit some consideration. They merits a little bit of our time and attention. Today we hear the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is Jesus' response to this question, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? I don't know for you, for me the image of neighbor conjures up all kinds of images. The first one that came to my mind was that sitcom, and I don't know the name of it, where the guy is peering over the fence and you never see him, right? And he has all kinds of wise things to say. What's it called? Is that Boy Meets World? Oh, isn't there another one that had Tool Time? Do you know? Boy Meets World. Ah, that's it. And so you keep watching for years thinking someday maybe you'll see that neighbor, right? But he's very smart. Sometimes I think of like having a cup of tea with your neighbor, like coming over onto the front porch. I think of sitting in Charlotte's garden. I think of being with Charlotte and Randy recently, actually. Very neighborly, even though we live on other sides of town. I think of sometimes I think of disputes, right? We talk about neighbors, and we have to admit it's not all pretty. I put my little note on Facebook, what I was writing about, and my friend Colin wrote a big note. I'm glad you're talking about boundaries, because I just put a giant fence behind my house because I can't stand my neighbors anymore, and my summer's looking a lot better as a result. So I have to be real about it, right? Sometimes Robert Frost, well, we'll get to Robert Frost in a minute, but sometimes some form of boundary is helpful and needed. Sometimes there's disputes. Your dog is barking too much. Your kids are playing their music too loud. The push and pull that happens when we all try to live together, right? And have all of our needs met and to all thrive. Sometimes neighbor relations break down altogether. Of course, Cleveland and LeBron James have broken up. And just like a good breakup, they're removing his picture from murals, like cutting the picture out, cutting them out of the pictures, burning his uniform. A part of relating and a part of neighbor relation is this connection, this boundary, this mysterious line between you and me. And these negotiations are all about that line, right? What is you? What is me? What is yours? What is mine? I think in stereotypical sense, liberals and conservatives sort of fall on ends of this spectrum, right? We often think of the conservative way of thinking as being a rigid boundary, a big wall, very strong. But I think conservatives would look at a liberal boundary and say, there are no boundaries, it's reckless, it's boundaryless, right? Hey, whatever, open the floodgates. I think this is how we can feel to one another, how we can look at one another. Rigidity, recklessness. I remember my friend Lawrence, when I was living in Somerville, right outside Boston where I grew up, and he was this retired guy from the Bronx who'd come up to live in Somerville and loved his house and loved community activism, and he decided that he didn't want any fences. And so he convinced two of his neighbors on either side. They went pretty readily and they took the fences down, but the guy in the back was like, I kind of like my fence. And Lawrence worked on him for like a year, just kept working on him. And eventually the guy like completely broke down and he said, all right, you can take that fence away, but you have to do it a little bit at a time, and you can only remove parts of it when I'm not home. Isn't that interesting? So it's like, I mean, our territories, our boundaries matter to us, and it's something he was aware enough to say, I want to do this gently, right? You can't just rip this fence away willy-nilly from me. I thought, and what happened, it was really quite lovely in a way. His wife was a great gardener, and she convinced all the neighbors to garden, and they developed these sort of free-flowing gardens that covered 6 or 7 properties behind their houses, you know, and you could really see how that would change a city, of course. And I remember listening to Lawrence on the local radio station one time, waxing poetic about a fence-free Somerville where dogs and children are running everywhere. He's an excellent guy. So we contemplate this question of boundaries and how we relate to one another. They're part of our lives, right? Our body has skin, our cell has walls. We shelter ourselves and look at this beautiful structure we're in, right? We seek little spaces and territories for ourselves. In a way, our shalom, our well-being, our health comes from having these healthy boundaries and finding healthy boundaries with our neighbors, which come through this process of negotiation. I think for boundaries, it's kind of like Goldilocks, right? Not too rigid, not too reckless, just right. Not static and habitual, alive, awake, aware, changing, moving, but always flowing with divine love. We talk about Robert Frost's, good fences make good neighbors, but that's not really what Frost was saying if you actually read his poem, The Mending Wall. Here's a little of it. What happens every year, it's about two men who every year go and mend the wall between their properties, right? I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each. And some are loaves, and some are nearly balls. We have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough, handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game. One on a side, it comes to little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine, and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. I think we take that last point, but really Frost is playing, right? He's playing with his neighbor and playing with this concept of boundaries. But you can also hear that he knows they're complicated. And as it continues, he talks about how disruptive forces tend to break boundaries down. He says the hunters come along and they pull out stones so that rabbits and dogs can sneak through. And then he says there's even a deeper force that frustrates this wall, that frustrates our boundary-making effort. He says, something there is that does not like a wall, that sends a frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps where even two can walk abreast. We know some about this in church. I'm thinking of our efforts, right, Fred? Is this speaking to our efforts? There's something out there that does not like a wall. Yeah, we've been, as a church and as trustees, we've been working with a very complex array of neighbors, right? We have our complex array of internal neighbors and a complex array of external neighbors, and we have complex church relationships. And the answer to just ignore all of that and to just let it all happen isn't quite stewardly and faithful, because these boundaries require this kind of attention. And yet then when we go in and we put attention into these boundaries and we try to secure all these spaces and we try to lock all these doors and we try to, have a sense of what should be happening where, that something there that does not like a wall seems to emerge and frustrate those attempts. But I think as a people, this is the challenge of the incarnate being. This is the challenge of living in the body. We build something that we want, and things dissipate and move and change and are dynamic, and this flow keeps coming through, and we have to remember that flow is love, that flow is God, and that this work of boundary building, boundary maintaining, just keeps on going. This is our human challenge. Let's see where to go from there. Indeed, there is something in the world that does not love a wall, a playful spirit foiling our schemes. And really, this playful spirit is a joy. We talked about the Colossians passage. Did you really listen to the Colossians passage that Kathleen read? Well, you're just going to have to go back and read Colossians, 1 to 14? It's such a beautiful, it made me think of our church, because really Paul is writing to the church and saying, we've heard all over the place about your acts of love. You're a little church, you're a struggling church, but there's one way to tell if you're a real church, and that's the fruits of the Spirit, right? Hope, faith, love. Look and see if you see them. If you see them, you're doing God's work. If you see fear, if you see hatred, if you see despair, the fruits are dying on the tree. Somewhere, signs are telling us we're going in the wrong direction, right? And so I was thinking about our church and thinking about Colossians, and I realized that we're a mega church. People are telling, I talk to my colleagues all the time, and they, the way pastors think, is your church growing? Right? There's this model, there's books, there's heaps of them. There's experts who'll come tell you how to become a mega church. And we're not quite that, right? I don't see a McDonald's and a Starbucks and a completely secured, reality with thousands of people. But it occurred to me as I thought about it, I said, my God, we are a mega church. We have thousands of seats a month, people coming in and out, right? A mega church would be 2,000, 3,000 people. Can you believe this tiny little space, this funny little corner on Park Ave, that all those people come to this space for healing? And then I start to look for God's signature in this, because I noticed that in the early church, there were no mega churches. Did you notice that? It was a group of people who gathered in a house, and they developed a spiritual depth, and they encouraged each other to completely embody and incarnate the teaching, just like Jesus is encouraging this lawyer to do today. Don't just study this teaching, make this teaching into your life. And we can't do that alone. We need each other. And so we all get together into this group. And this is what God's churches kind of look like, right? You saw the disciples, Jesus and the disciples. They looked like that, a group of people. Not a huge group of people, but outside you start to get these concentric circles of impact, people that we touch. And I see that here. We have these circles. We connect with Spiritus. We have friends here today from Spiritus, right? We connect with the groups that come all through this building. And then suddenly you see that people are coming into that space to get healing. I see God's fingerprints all over that. This is how God likes to design things, right? We have a structured, controlled, we set it up this way, let's keep it this way forever way of thinking. But there is this consistency to kind of God's architecture. And I see it here. I feel like Paul writing to the Colossians. Be encouraged, and I pray for you without ceasing, because I see the fruits of the Spirit. Do you see the fruits of the Spirit here? This thing is not easy. Sometimes our work takes us down through the bloody pass, as it was called. That was that wilderness road from Jerusalem down to Jericho. There's no question that we all take that road during different times in our life. There, the man's accosted by robbers. But this is really an image of hitting bottom, right? So we know this experience of hitting bottom. And maybe some of us hit it harder and some of us hit it softer, but we all walk that journey. And what's surprising about it is that sometimes a completely unexpected person comes and helps us. Have you found that in your bottom places? It's not always the ones you expect. It's not always the clergy, right? It's not the ones who are paid to do it. It's somebody somewhere comes, maybe. Do we see it, right? Comes. But ultimately we realize as we travel that journey that it's up to God to rescue us. We can help for a time like the Samaritan did, right? We can give a few coins, we can sit and listen, we can do those things, but there is no human being that ultimately rescues us, right? It's God that comes and rescues the day. But our neighbor becomes the one who showed us mercy. So I'm wondering how your boundary work is going. Are you needing more love into your earthly body, into your relationships, into your neighborhoods, into our laws, into our churches, into the places where urban and meets suburban meets rural, in those lines where the races meet, in the lines where the classes meet, those lines where nation meets nation. Are we needing more love into those places? The image that came to my mind is how much joy can live in such a small space. And that happened for me when some of you have seen my fruit trees. And I decided I wanted to have fruit trees in my little city yard. And I learned this technique called espalier, where you can put 10 fruit trees in 20 feet of space and train them as a fence, right? And so now I have this fence that's, 20 feet long and about a foot wide, and it's a lattice work of branches. And in that fence live all kinds of birds. Over 3 years, more and more birds I've never seen before started showing up and hanging out in that fence. And in that fence in the spring, green and purple and all colors of cream and white flowers appear. And currently in that fence, there's bright red cherries, there's hard green apples, there's hundreds of plums, there's soft blushing peaches. And in that fence run squirrels. And sometimes a breeze will blow and a flock of birds will fly out of that just blows my mind. Just this funny little fence in the middle of the city. And sometimes I go under and I find Jordan, my dog, snuggled up on one side and the 2 dogs on the other side snuggled up, all just sleeping together in the fence. A living fence, a fence that bears fruit. These are our boundaries. I think of Emmanuel like this. I think we're that kind of boundary place, that kind of living fence, that kind of place where many meet and many are sheltered. So let's keep on keeping on, following those signs of life.